I'm super excited to bring this special edition of Unscripted. See, as we close out 2024 and welcome 2025, we here at LeaseLock decided to conduct a survey of a very highly curated group of multifamily leaders, asking them what their outlook and expectations for 2025 were. We were absolutely blessed to be allowed to peek inside the 2025 playbooks of top owners and operators, and candidly, we're just excited to share the findings. Some we fully expected, but also a few that were actually really surprising. Well, at least to me and my guest co-host for this episode, Jeremy Thomason, partner at Convolo Capital and industry advisor for us here at LeaseLock. We dig through the survey and provide the results, but if you want more, we have produced a white paper that includes the mega trends we identified, as well as provides you with the results directly. The link for which is in the show notes. But before we get to the results, we have to get to the one part of the show that is indeed super scripted, the disclaimer. That the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of LeaseLock. The content is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice or endorsement. While we strive to ensure that the content is as accurate and up-to-date as possible, LeaseLock makes no representations or warranties of any kind, expressed or implied, regarding the accuracy, completeness, or reliability of the information discussed. The content is provided as is, and LeaseLock assumes no responsibility for any errors or omissions. Listeners should always consult with qualified professionals before making any decisions based on the content of the podcast. This podcast may include references to third-party sources, which are provided for convenience and informational purposes only. LeaseLock does not endorse or take responsibility for the accuracy or reliability of any third-party content. In no event shall LeaseLock, its affiliates, or any of its employees, officers, or agents be liable for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, or consequential damages arising out of or in conjunction with the use or the reliance of the content of this podcast. Now, the highly scripted disclaimer out of the way, let's unpack the 2025 Multifamily Outlook Survey results. Awesome. Well, Jeremy, I appreciate you coming in and doing this. I'm actually really excited to have this conversation with you because this is all about a recap on the multifamily survey that we sent out at the end of last year. But before I just kind of dive into this, because you and I will geek out over this. Yeah. One of the reasons I loved bringing you on, you can give a full introduction to yourself. One of the things I'd love bringing you on is you're both an industry advisor for LeaseLock, but you're also in the business as well. Right. And for full disclosure, correct me if I'm wrong, you were a survey participant too,
yes,
correct?
I'm one of the people. So I don't even remember exactly how I answered every question in the survey.
Oh, I've got it written down.
Okay, good. So hopefully I don't contradict myself. But anyway, yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, so let's give a little bit of background on what we did with the survey on this. And so for the survey itself, we actually sent out to pretty much mostly C-level executives, high-level asset managers, so both owners and operators. We made sure we covered both the owner-operator as well as the third-party managers. And it was a survey of, I want to say 15 questions. I probably should know that answer for a recap, but I don't know. It was a combination of multiple choices, a lot of fill-in like blank words, which I was really impressed with the amount of in-depth insights people gave us in the commentary, and we'll kind of get to some of that. But it really was, again, focused on those leadership roles of multifamily. Because we had as many responses as we did, we didn't want to put like raw numbers out there. So you'll see everything kind of presented as a percentage of people who responded to them. And there were several questions that, just so you know, we allowed people to do multiple answers on a few of them. In fact, you commented on one where you were mad that I didn't let you do multiple answers, or I limited it to a certain amount. So, as we kind of start and jump through this, the first question that we asked everyone was, how do you think 2025 is going to compare versus 2024? I'll turn to you, Jeremy. I would say that my impression of the answer was that people were cautiously optimistic. But what were your thoughts when you started looking at the results?
That's the right way to describe it. I mean, I think everybody wants to be optimistic because it's been a while now with this last cycle. Once interest rates started up, all of the stress that has been in place and has slowed down transactions and all of the things that the acquisition side of the business is so troubled with whenever volumes fall off the cliff, and then you start dealing with distress and can't make mortgage payments and all those kinds of things. So there's a hopefulness that I think is embedded in the human nature of people that sort of says we're sure hoping that survive to 25, that 25 starts to become the inflection point. And I know that's part of the answers later on in the discussion. So um, I feel like that cautiously optimistic is probably the great way to describe it, because there's still some fear, for sure.
Yeah, very much. Like it was, and we're sharing the results at some point on the screen where you can actually see that. You'll notice that there were nobody who ranked it 1 or 2.
Right.
Everyone was either we think it's going to be about the same as 24 or is going to be better than 2025. And it was interesting when I started to look at the breakdown between, okay, well, because the answers I got to say are not completely anonymous. Like
Right.
we're not given the list of who responded, but I did kind of look at, okay,
Yeah.
how did owners look at these questions? How did operators look at these questions? And it was the ownership and investment side that seemed to be a little more optimistic about 25. But I think that really, to your point, focuses in on, we think acquisitions are going to start happening again. We
Right.
think deals are going to start trading again. I think operators are still kind of thinking 25 is going to be rough
Yeah.
because no, it's not 600,000 units being delivered. It's still 400,000 units
Right.
being delivered in 25. So that was an interesting takeaway from it.
Yeah, I sort of jotted down in just preparation for this question. It's like, okay, what are the bullets that would cause me to be a pessimist? What are the bullets that would cause me to be an optimist? And so if I start with the negative so we can end on the upside here, the pessimist side of me is, hey, the 10-year is running the wrong way.
Yeah.
And that's how debt is priced. And even though, um, the Fed has certainly started with an inflection point, the 10-year seems to be out of control. It seems like a lot of people would say that, and no one can really sort of figure that out. Concessions are still in the market prevalently, and that, finds its way into financials. Bad debt expense is high, and collections. The certainly the catastrophic events of fires and hurricanes and all those kinds of things, and what does that mean, and geopolitical, all kinds of unrest still, and that's probably always the case. Tariffs, what is that going to mean? So there's plenty of
Yeah.
reasons, if you are a pessimist kind of personality type, to sort of be paralyzed. But that's not what our survey suggested. It's
No.
like there's cautious optimism. So in spite of all those things, what are the reasons to be optimistic? And hey, I do think there was an inflection point on interest rates, and whether the 10-year responds now or eventually, I do think that rates are on the way down. So that's a positive thing. And I think cap rates will probably follow, as they typically do, on that. So that's a reason to be optimistic. Unemployment has stayed, whether it's a Goldilocks scenario, unemployment has actually not spiked, even though there's a little worry that it might. But we sort of need that perfect balance in order for rates to continue down. But at 4% unemployment, that's not a bad number historically.
Right.
So okay, I can live with that. For some markets like where we live in Dallas, where I invest in Atlanta and Dallas areas, there's still very positive migration stories. So those are great things. Now, not every market has that.
Of course
So
not. Yeah.
if you're in a net negative migration
Well, I
area,
mean, and as Jay Parsons loves to say, everyone likes to say, real estate is a hyper local business. Like you might
absolutely.
look at a market, but it's the street corner you're on.
Sure. Um, One of the bigger things that was a problem for us, along with interest rates, we was insurance and taxes, property taxes, especially in markets like Texas, where property tax is a big thing. But I actually see some silver linings. The insurance renewals, in spite of big cat events that I've gone through last year, were significantly down.
Yeah.
And part of that's because the baseline went up so high the last few years. Doubling effect happened to me a couple of years back, where my insurance doubled year over year. But in my renewals so far this year, they've been down, and there seems to be like there's more market entrance on that. So in spite of all the cat events that's sort of scary, insurance seems to be a better story. And we do know that there's been some distressed properties that have traded. So that starts to, from a appraisal perspective, from arguing with the appraisal districts, as we get to the property tax side of thing, I do think that we will see some upside there in that we don't have runaway property taxes. And then the biggest one is the supply cliff,
Yeah.
which everybody's talking about. So there's plenty of reasons to be an optimist too, which is why I think in balancing the two, we end up with a 3, 4, 5 on a 1 through 5 rating on the scale, and nobody rated 1 or 2. And probably most everybody was in that 3, cautiously optimistic. And then there's certainly some bullish people in the survey too that answer 4 and 5.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get expense control. Absolutely is going to come up later in this because that's obviously still a major focus for a lot of folks. But I think it's a good segue going into what our next one was, which this is a question that we did, really narrow people's opportunity to give answers to, because I think this was the one you teased me on. Like I wanted to pick all the options. And that was kind of answering what is your primary focus. And we said we were really talking about their firm's primary focus for 2025. And when you look at the results on this, again, expressed as a percentage, that's in there, it was interesting to me because I kind of looked at it and looked at the different categories and said, not just, okay, everyone's focused on improved asset valuation. Like, for the audience who are just listening at this, both resident satisfaction and improved asset valuation were by far the strongest of all the opportunities that are out there. And we're dead tied at the percentage point that they were. But I started looking at the other options, which were, cost reduction and mitigation, and technology integration came in 4th, and employee satisfaction came in at the 5th spot. And I started to think about, okay, are these people issues? Are these economic and controllable issues? Are these technological issues? And it was really interesting to me that the economic stresses, the improved asset valuation and cost reduction, we're right on par with the people stresses, the resident satisfaction and the employee satisfaction. You add those two up together, they almost were exactly the same when you started to put those together. So I don't know about you, that was one of the things that stood out to me about these results.
Yeah, I mean, part of the challenge with the way you asked the questions, which is why I wanted to answer all of the above, is all of them are important. And so,
but if everything's important, nothing is.
Correct.
So what's the most important one?
Right. So that's the challenge, right? Is like your question is dead on about what's the primary focus, right? And so, my view of it is that, of course, improved asset valuation is always going to be at the top of everybody's mind, no matter what cycle you're in. But yet that is in essence.
But interestingly, though, you say that it's tied with resident satisfaction and others. Because again, we didn't allow people to have multiples on this one.
Correct.
So again, it's one of those things that I love kind of calling out and seeing from this. And it is, I will tell you, looking through the answers and knowing who said what, this is an owner versus an operator result for sure. That's the owner asset.
And that's a great point because, obviously true operators that are operators with a third party or whatever, their job is resident satisfaction and making sure that everything happens as it needs to happen. And you hit the bonanza whenever you have a third party operator that can actually think like an owner.
Yeah.
Certainly that's why a lot of groups are vertically integrated, because they sort of make that all one. But sometimes that's hard to do when you're in that third party world of, hey, that they're not necessarily thinking about the sort of asset management type strategy questions, which get into valuations and some of the cash flow challenges that are, not related to controllables. So there is a definite dichotomy in whether you're an owner or an operator and probably how these work. But I was sort of pleased to see that the employee and the resident still has a outsized sort of portion of this. So it's not about all the fin bros and all the number parts of this.
Well, that's really interesting. Bring up the fin bros and those in there, because number one, residents are going to come up strong later on this. There are a couple of really interesting trends from, again, some of the writing answers. But interesting again on this one, I always like to call out the answers that didn't get anything as well. So in this particular question, we actually did give everyone the opportunity to do other. And then we also had one around, really DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And we literally got not a single answer around DEI, which surprised me. It didn't surprise me. It didn't really surprise me because it hasn't been a strong focus outside of everyone thinks the sovereign wealth funds have a DEI component that's attached to it. And for a while, people were really trying to chase that capital. So that part of it kind of surprised me. The other thing that surprised me, especially going back to the attitudes people have as they expressed in the first question, almost every write-in answer we had was all about revenue growth.
Yeah.
Their number one priority is revenue growth, which kind of a little bit signals a shift from what we've seen in 24, where everyone was like, it's cost reduction.
Yeah.
So that was just another interesting takeaway that I saw.
Yeah, I do want to comment on the DEI thing. And so, without getting too political, that's the problem with even using the acronym DEI.
Agreed.
Is I think that almost nobody would disagree that the concepts behind what DEI represent are really good. They're good for humanity. They're
Yep.
good for business, all of those things. But how it's been weaponized into politics and just even issuing DEI, people have a reaction and they stop listening. So that's a hard part about how DEI gets manifested. We sit here in Texas and there's literally laws now that you can't use
Correct.
DEI.
Yeah.
So it's
dismantling the DEI offices on campuses.
Correct.
Like by requirement.
Right. Yeah. I was just reading an article about my alma mater, and the governor was
Really? What school would that be?
That would be Texas A&M. So I had to do the name drop there. So yeah, I mean, just this anecdote of there was some conference that the conference itself was sort of a minority type conference, and Texas A&M was sending people to it, and somebody brought that up to the governor, and the governor was like, no, that violates your public institution, and Mr. President of the institution, Mark Walsh is his name, you're going to be fired if you don't deal with this. And so it's like that's a good example of, not trying to pick on any of these folks, but it's like, okay, DE&I, politicized, weaponized, be careful about how you use it, but the concepts behind it, I think are still very appropriate. So depending on where you're in the country, you might have a different view on it.
Yeah, that's actually a really good thing to point out. And I would say, just from a timing perspective, so people understand, we did do this entire survey after the election was done,
Right.
after results are out. So it's there was that clarity around that. But you're absolutely right. You're right. It's been weaponized is the best way to put it. You put it really well. Okay, so let's move on. And the next one that we really started to ask, and I should point out all these graphics that are up there, I did actually use ChatGPT with the answers that were in there to say, how can you draw me an image that represents whatever we're talking about. So this was the overcoming the challenges in multifamily, and the results on this one, again, this was a multiple choice where you could offer multiple answers to the same one, but you couldn't answer them all. I never let you guys do that. And you can kind of see that. I think that 2024 is still got a real strong hangover on 2025, because the number one answer, as you can see, and for those listening, was well over 70% of respondents had this in their top three, was economic uncertainty. It was by far the number one. And it was interesting that the two most from the operations perspective, again, were cost control. It's economic uncertainty really is, essentially a cost control, whether it's, the interest rate or everything else. And right next to that was cost pressures was that there. Any strong takeaways from the data that we saw through here?
Again, part of the challenge, of course, with some of these questions is like, have we ever had economic certainty? So it's like we're always in the vein of, we don't really know what the future is.
Right.
And so maybe there are definitely flare-ups of more uncertainty. Back to some of the big macro discussions around, we don't really know where interest rates are going. We don't really know where geopolitical is. We don't really know what one of the items on here, regulatory, that didn't really, it's on the list. So that's an interesting one. And
it got 30%. I mean, 30% of the people thought regulatory pressures were going to be an issue. I thought it'd be stronger than that.
Right.
But it's still there.
And I, we pay attention in that world.
True.
Right, wrong, or different. We do. And it plays in advocacy quite quickly. But I think our industry is understanding how regulatory and advocacy are more and more and more important.
Yeah.
And 10 years ago, there were a few people that probably were into politics as just a sort of personal passion that in our industry. But now it just seems like the events that the organization puts on, NMHC, NAA, even the local stuff. I chair the legislative committee for Apartment Association in Greater Dallas. We have a robust agenda for the Texas legislature this year. And the reality is that if we're not advocating, then the regulatory piece of it can all of a sudden really cause some problems, which is why I feel like that number there, if you'd had the benefit of doing this same survey over many years, I would be willing to bet that regulatory is on its move up
Yeah.
as one of the areas that is expected to be a challenge for.
Well, I'll tell you, I haven't had the benefit of doing this survey year after year. I have been involved in previous years with a similar style process. Wasn't quite as open, free form questions. Regulatory pressures never was even on the radar for what we were doing in that. And it is really interesting. I was having a conversation with Greg Willett yesterday, actually. For those who don't know, Greg Willett's an economic expert within the multifamily space. But he was commenting very astutely that the regulatory pressure, we focus on the national level and we have that. It takes one city council member to capsize your individual investment. Again, it's that hyper localization of what real estate really is. So the other thing I would say is for this one, again, I always like looking at what didn't happen on these. We did get answers for every possible answer we gave, with the exception of other. Nobody did a write-in vote for this one. Okay. So this really does, that list up there really does, I think, represent a really good snapshot into what are people concerned about. From there, we kind of went on to, okay, what are the different things that could be affecting? We know where people think or how optimistic they are. We know what they think is going to be some of the major hurdles, what they're focused on. At the end of the day, we're a prop tech company, in fintech. So we wanted to ask the question, okay, what does, the role of technology look like moving forward? And again, this was one where we kind of put it on a scale between 1 to 5 and said, 1 meaning it's going to be significantly less important moving forward. 5 being there's going to be a significant increase in the influence of technology. This isn't, hey, are you going to buy more technology, but the influence of technology. I looked at the results on this one where most people are saying it's a moderate increase. Yeah. And to me, I think this question was kind of a gimme. It was kind of like this is exactly what I was expecting. Right. But I do wonder if, and we'll get to AI, because what would be a multifamily conversation without saying the letters AI be, I do wonder if AI is going to start really pushing this faster than we're expecting it to.
I think it probably will. I wasn't surprised. I think whenever I answered, I said moderate increase. Our industry goes from savvy, large, well-capitalized institutional all the way down to mom and pop that probably still invite their applicant over and interview them and decide whether or not they think that's the right person and accept checks in their mailbox slot for their rent payments, all the way to the other extreme of bots doing everything and there's no on-site people. And tech is the way all of that happens, from the least sophisticated all the way to the most. And what I would say is that there's a wave of technological advancement that our industry is just always on. And so we are progressively always getting more and more tech advanced. So the least sophisticated is now probably got some sort of online presence and probably has tools that allow them to accept online payments. The most
I don't know how they survived COVID if they didn't.
Right.
I mean, honestly.
And my point is that the least sophisticated still exists in our industry, but they are becoming more and more sophisticated. Yeah. So depending on where you are on the adoption curve is absolutely moving towards more tech advancement. And the bleeding edge of that is the topics of AI, and how does AI then integrate even AI on top of tech and all of those types of. It's almost like second generation stats in the NFL. It's like, nobody used to know the miles per hour that somebody is running when they're running down the field. They knew what their 40 time was, but they didn't know miles per hour. Well, now we do. And so that same kind of thing is happening in the multifamily industry is that there's more and more tech solutions that are making things more efficient. And therefore, there is always going to be an increase. The challenge as an operator is I only have so much bandwidth, change control bandwidth in my organization.
Right.
I can't do everything I want to do.
You bring up a really good point. This is one of the insights that I kind of gleaned out of this as well. I mean, to give people kind of a representation of this, 90% of respondents said that technology was either going to have a moderate or a significant increase. 2024, we heard a lot of folks saying, I'm digesting what we already put in place. I'm trying to get it right. No more new tech at this point in time. I really wonder if that's an indication that groups have worked through that phase now and are ready to take on the brain damage that you mentioned of, it takes a lot to implement a new solution. So I do wonder if that's not an indicator in there.
For any of the supplier side that are listening to this, what I would say is that every supplier that's doing anything more than like the pool guy, and maybe even the pool guy has some sort of AI thing.
I have an app on my pool that will let me do everything for my pool. Yes.
So they're it's like an arms race. It seems like in the tech space, the prop tech space, that how do you incorporate AI, Virtuoso, Eli, Realm, AI screening, all of them, right? They're just coming up with ways to do the marketing side because all of them have to be adopting, whether it's on the consumer side of Siri and Apple to Gemini, and they're all sort of competing in that AI space. And so every software provider is having to do this.
Right.
And so then if I use software and then either I'm getting the AI solutions as a part of my purchasing that I've already do, because now I'm the supplier selling software. If I'm not doing AI and my competitors are, then I'm at risk of having my customer fire me and hire somebody else. Or on the rev side of it, if there is an AI solution that actually is valuable enough for me to upsell, I've got to have AI or I'm not going to be able to compete as a software supplier in this world. So it's almost like that's going to happen one way or another in our space. And it's, as an operator, I'm going to get the benefit of it because I'm using tech already, and the tech is going to get integrated with AI solutions.
Right. That's super well said. Okay, so that's actually a really good segue because you mentioned all of the vendors that are listening, etc. Well, to all the vendor partners who might be listening, yes, we asked the question: what technologies are you actually considering for next year? And no, we're not going to sell the list. But this was one that we were pretty intentional on when it came to AI. We were pretty intentional on separating out large language models, bots, etc., with what I would call optimization learning mechanisms, the machine guided learning, those types of things. And when you look at the results, what actually surprised me, to be perfectly honest, I was expecting the utilization of data and the maximization of data not to be number one and large language models to be tied for number two. I was expecting that to be reversed. Did that surprise you as well? Was there something else that jumped out for you?
I don't know that I have an informed enough opinion about all of the different usage cases of AI at this point to be able to differentiate one versus the other. I think when ChatGPT came onto the scene and we quickly learned what large language models is, that's sort of permeates, I think, what probably mainstream understanding of what AI is really based on the large language model thought.
For sure, yes.
But just like, you went to ChatGPT and created a diagram or a picture, right, using ChatGPT. So the creative side of what AI is interesting. How it replaces legal services, going to be really interesting. Yeah. So there's a lot of different sort of usage cases for AI. I can make a business card today that has me in a tuxedo, that has me, in my surf attire or whatever, real easily. So there's a lot of different usage cases. And so, how I feel like that digesting massive amounts of data is probably why that was ranked so high, given who your audience was in this survey, because they're generally larger executive type firms that have to digest large amounts of information, and to the extent that you can use tools to do that faster, quicker, easier, that's probably why that rose to the top, if I had to guess.
For sure, yeah. I mean, you could do behavioral modeling in it. Like, what does the resident who is more likely to renew, what are the behaviors that they're expressing before they actually renew? So you know those types of things. I'm fascinated with the concept, or trying to answer the question, do concessions have an impact on renewal conversion ratios? I've used it quite a bit on that level. In fact, I did one based on 2024 data and 2023 data that has a really interesting result that I'm going to post here probably next week. Well, it'll come out before this is actually going out from a recording perspective, where it looks like the percentage of people giving a concessions matters more than the amount of the concession.
Okay.
There's no correlation between the amount of the concession relative to renewal ratio, either the year you're offering it or the year you're not, the next year.
Interesting.
But the penetration level, absolutely, there's a correlation.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Would I be able to do that statistical modeling through Excel? Sure. It's going to take me weeks.
Right.
Can I be able to just literally throw it in ChatGPT as a raw data and ask the question? It's exactly what I did.
I know you and I were talking about this subject. I know it's something that you've pondered for years.
Yes.
And it starts to become interesting. So if it's the rising tide and the lowering tide of all ships, it's like if the market that you're in, the hyperlocal market, is offering concessions at the point in time that your renewal activity is happening, well, then I have a feeling somebody that's used to concessions is going to be more apt to move to go get the next concession. But if that person came into the unit with concessions and then they are renewing at a point in time when there are no concessions in the market, well then, okay, what do? Move to another state that has concessions in it?
Yeah.
Probably not. So it's just a really fascinating correlation, because I have a feeling that there are definitely a subset today of folks that came in with a concession and are looking at the markets right now and saying, hey, if I can figure out how to move myself and I can move across the street or even across town and not have to pay rent for a month or even 2 months, well, yeah, I'll do it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's again where I'm trying to get to. But to wrap this one up just a little bit, because there's one other interesting thing I found on this one, and it's not directly from the survey, but that energy efficient systems, basically that is all the smart home technology that's out there, really low on people's category overall. But what I find fascinating about this is a couple of years ago, the Center for Generational Kinetics did a resident survey.
Yeah.
And they specifically asked about smart home technology, or really amenities that you're willing to pay for. One of the top ones was smart home technology, specifically Ring doorbells, etc. And I'll plug an upcoming podcast episode. I actually had the opportunity to sit down with Dave Marcinkowski with Quext, and he's also with Madera Realty. So it was interesting to talk to him because he sees it from the ownership side and he sees it from the actual technology side. And I literally was asking, why the disconnect? Why is this something that residents say they want and will pay for?
Yeah.
But yet owners are like, yeah, no, that's not on the top of my list. It was just an interesting.
I can't wait to listen to that.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting one. Okay, so continuing down the path of kind of major things that are happening in the multifamily space. We talked about regulatory challenges already, but I did kind of go back into it, and I said, okay, how concerned are you? So this was another one that was interesting to me. If you go back to what do we think the major challenges are? Regulatory concerns was 30%. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't, it was a strong answer, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't at the top of economic uncertainty, et cetera. But when we asked people how concerned they were, again, nobody's not concerned about it at all. But the vast majority, if this was the outlook, we would have called this cautiously optimistic.
Right.
So is this cautiously pessimistic?
Yeah.
Probably right.
I wrote elevated only because I feel like the highly folks are probably either dealing with it themselves and therefore are in the middle of it, because some of the folks that are in the survey are certainly large operators that the larger the operator is, the more likelihood that the regulators have them in their crosshairs. And so that's a dangerous position to be in. Speaking to the choir here, this is an area that you know a lot about, and it's just a dangerous place for our industry, and it's why advocacy is so important.
Yeah.
If you think about it, your example of, it's one thing if you're talking to officials at HUD that live and breathe housing on every kind of level that there is. And it's another thing if you're talking about a city council person and the level of education. I'm not talking about schooling or even intelligence on complicated subjects. Whenever you have the power of setting an ordinance in place that is going to affect, how you do evictions, or it's going to affect the fees that are charged, or it's going to affect how you do a judgment kind of issue with a resident whenever there's a situation. Those kinds of things are why advocacy is so important.
Yeah.
And so I'm not surprised, I guess, on the elevated concern, because these issues now are not sort of tangential to the mainline issues. These were front and line. Affordable housing was a frontline issue in the presidential campaign.
It's still a frontline issue. But
Right.
yeah, you're absolutely right. It was a frontline there, but it's still a frontline issue amongst regulators. I mean, that is one of the things that, again, we've talked about this already, but I think it's really super important to stress it again, is we all have a role to play in this.
Right.
And I will readily admit, I was not on this bandwagon until about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Much more in the last 18 months. And I now see the importance of advocacy, and to your point, on all levels, because personal story, my wife ran for town council at one point. She lost the election by 99 votes. And thank God she lost the election, by the way. It was so well off because of that. But when we're thinking about how close these elections are in these areas that we're serving, where we have employees and residents who have a vested interest in particular outcomes, I think that as an industry, we can do more, particularly on the operator side. We can do more to help mobilize that force, to help really make sure that providing housing of all types is prioritized at every level of government. So that's my takeaway from this one, is we're worried about it, but what do we do about it?
Yeah, I think that the affordable housing crisis, whatever term you want to associate with it, is the permeating issue. And then all of the other issues, whether it's junk fees, revenue management, evictions, all the other things that come up, regulatory, they're derivatives of the affordable housing.
1,000%.
Right.
Yes.
So understanding that. And then, so I said before that I chair the legislative committee for the Apartment Association here in Dallas. And as we are forming our committee for the year and what our objectives are, I was at the board meeting this past Tuesday, and I made the statement, whether you are formally on our committee or not, everybody is on the committee, because we all have a piece to play in the advocacy. You don't know when you're going to be sitting on an airplane next to somebody that's a policymaker. You don't know whenever you're just at a restaurant or out about town. You need to have somewhat of an informed opinion on the issues of what our industry are, so that you can dispel some of the myths that are out there. And you don't have to be a policy wonk. You just need to know how to defend sort of our industry. And honestly, you need to know how to get in touch with the people in case you see an issue locally, especially hyper locally, that some city council somewhere put something in place, and you need to be able to know who to call to try to go help, because there's a lot of us that can sort of swoop in and say, hey, here is the information that you need to get in front of that policymaker, so that you're not dealing in unknowns and myths and stereotypes that can happen with NIMBYism and all the other issues that can come into play. So I don't think that elevated concern is surprising to me, because the issues, especially in the press, have now become something that are on the front page of the Wall Street Journal regularly.
Yep.
So therefore, that's going to create concern. But what do you do about it is the advocacy front.
That 1,000%. I guess we'll move on and get off of our soapbox on this one, because I think you and I could go on for
Yes.
quite a bit on that one. And where we'll move to next is actually where I started to get really, really interesting in this, because one of the ways that operators and owners have really battled the lack of rent growth and all this new supply that's coming down the pipe is really focusing on renewals, really focusing on resident satisfaction. And with the supply pipeline starting to turn off, now granted, again, we're still getting 400,000 units this year, so that's a lot. But people are looking at 26, 27. I did have the question in the back of my head, are people still going to be really focused on renewals and really focused on resident satisfaction? So when we were building the survey, I added that directly in.
Yep.
And this was another one. I'll be honest, this is one, and for those again who are just listening, the results were overwhelmingly, it was a high priority, meaning that people were answering 60% of the time, people put this as a 5. Like it is their priority. No one put it below moderate.
Yeah.
And the vast majority, I mean, you're talking 90-ish%, or actually a little over 90%, were either saying it was a somewhat high priority or a very high priority for their organization. It just really surprised me when we saw unprecedented renewal conversion in 2024, that people really still do have it as that high a priority. Were you surprised as I was, or is this like I was fully expecting that?
I don't know that I was surprised, only because, as a FinBro, the economic costs of vacancy are so, I think part of the lessons that we learned in unpacking what retention really means, that a lot of us really got educated on how expensive vacancy is. Yeah. And how difficult sometimes it is to even pinpoint the total cost of vacancy across 5 or 6 different entry points into our P&L that are not the same month. So it's really sometimes difficult to unpack what true vacancy costs. So I'm not surprised that high priority. In fact, I would ask, so what's a higher priority for someone on this subject? And there probably is, in a nuanced way, for certain operators, why they would answer that way. But I wasn't that surprised that it was 4 and 5 on how we did the survey. I think where your point is that, hey, this was 4 and 5 last year. Is it still 4 and 5? Because we did a pretty good job. I think it's probably I think the lesson that we've learned is until we see double-digit rent growth again, which is probably the only reason why you wouldn't want to have retention, is if I can get a new lease and put it at 15% more versus a renewal on somebody that's at 6%, that's whenever I think the edge comes off of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. This has always been one, for years and years and years, I was in the revenue management space, and this has always been one where it always comes down to, okay, well, what's your strategy? Like, what's your investment strategy? And that's why this one surprised me a little bit, especially when you had a couple people earlier who said that our number one priority is revenue growth. And revenue growth happens through the combination of 2 things. It's obviously the rents that you're charging and the occupancy that you're keeping.
Right.
These results tell me that they're very much focused on keeping the occupancy, just as you mentioned. You get an upward cycle. People are trying to sell a building. They're trying to position a rent roll. Very oftentimes, you're much more focused on the rent because of the long-term impact it has on asset valuation and really to get a deal done. And that's why it surprised me. I do think, and I've talked to him directly about this, so he knows I'm about to call him out on it. Jay Parsons always loves to do what he got wrong in the year, right?
Yeah.
I think this is the point that Jay is going to get wrong this year. He is expecting renewal levels to probably still be elevated, but to come down. In fact, most economists are be elevated, but come down off of the peak that we saw in 2024. This data, along with what we're about to talk about, where other people are figuring out how they're going to get there, leads me to believe that it's going to stay where it's at. I think we're going to be in the mid 50s like we were in 2024, because it's still such a strong focus. And if I'm being really transparent, operators are slow to change.
Yeah.
We've had that focus on cost reduction through retention. It's going to be really hard to turn that boat around really fast as well. So
I think as we have learned how to measure the impacts of what retention brings us all the way down to the NOI level, then it's really hard to get off that drug. So it's like, oh, wow, I know that if I decrease my days vacant by 2 days, what that actually amounts to across a portfolio. And now I know that, and I'm watching it and I'm measuring it. That will, I think, bolster your argument that it's always going to end up being one of those. Obviously, we have occupancy. That's the number one KPI in our industry, probably always will be.
Drives me freaking nuts, but that's okay.
Right. Retention, I think, is climbing the chart really quickly to be the number 2 KPI. It really is. And so that's why I think that, there certainly will always be dynamic movement with it, but that's why I would agree with you that that's just a hyper focus. In the reports from my prior company that we put out on Monday morning, obviously occupancy, leased occupancy, those kinds of things, collections, economic occupancy, retention was one of the numbers we added to it, because it's such an impactful part to the P&L if you have a high retention rate.
Well, I mean, I'll nerd out on the math for a little bit, then we'll move on. Because one of the questions we asked next, which was my favorite question we asked because the way people answered it was, okay, if this is such a high priority, what are you tactically going to do about it? But you've always got that, folks, who you want that occupancy as high as possible, right? It's a lot easier to maintain a 97, 98% occupancy if you're doing a 60 to 65% retention ratio, because you're not turning as many units. If you're doing a 50% retention, you are not going to be above a 96.
Right.
Mathematically, it's just not going to work because you're turning your units.
Right.
So it very much it's a cascading effect, and it's all an ecosystem. But I can go on for this for days. So as I mentioned, the next question we asked, and by the way, if you took the survey, if you're one of those leaders who took the survey and you're listening to this, I just want to you did. Thank you. This was a free form answer question. And I really thought we were going to get 2-word answers. People gave us business plans in this. It was awesome to see the results. And, there's really no graphic we can show to do this, but one of the absolute themes that comes back to what we talked about earlier from technology, I think AI was mentioned directly in renewals specifically in over half the answers. I really think that people think that AI is going to be the white horse that the hero rides in on this. Which really surprised me, because when I think about retention, I think about building a community. And is AI really going to be able to build the community through those communications? I mean, that was the theme that jumped off the page for me on this one. How about you?
Agreed. And this gets into, I think most people recognize the place of AI, and you did an incredible podcast about what does AI not represent and the EQ part of it. And so how do you sort of use AI to be more efficient, to give you more time to actually spend on the EQ part, whether it's with your staff or it's with your actual residents? Because let's face it, AI can't really do a pizza party.
Correct.
So, there's going to be a need for that community part that is touchy-feely, that isn't. But if I can be more efficient at my job and all of the basic parts of doing my job, and that frees me up 2 more hours to be able to do a pizza party, well, then there's a derivative effect to it.
Yep.
So I do feel like that.
And that was definitely mentioned, by the way. That was it wasn't as strong a theme as AI, but that was definitely mentioned. The other thing that you brought up in there that was definitely mentioned was communication to the resident beyond just, here's your renewal offer letter.
Yeah.
Like that was another specific theme that was called out. And then the last one that at least that jumped to me, and again, I'll turn back to you to see if you have anything else that was in there, was the concept of stability in your staff. That was called out. That was like, hey, I'm going to reduce my staff turnover, which does help me with my communication, does help me with my service, et cetera. And it really, to me, was, expressing the JW Marriott approach. And I used to work for Marriott, so it's still stuck in me a little bit. But the JW Marriott approach of, if you take care of your associates will take care of your guests.
Right.
On that. And that was another thing that I liked seeing coming out of the data.
Yeah, a company back in my banking days, founder we did a lot of business with. The founder of that company was he's 89 years old at this point, so he is not low tech. He's no tech. That's the generation of no tech.
I think we have all experienced them.
Right. but did some profound things. And he was famous for a statement that he said, if you treat your customers like your friends, then they'll always be your customers. And that concept can ring through to residents as well.
Oh, for sure, yes.
And so if you figure out how to free up time with technology to do your job better on those fronts, but you don't lose that community aspect of it, you're going to see the benefit of better retention, more resident referrals, better community, probably better collections, better, less trash around the property, all of those things that you associate with people that would call their apartment a home versus the transient nature that often gets associated with apartment dwellers.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. And I do think that the language that we use, the vocabulary that we use matters. And I think that we can go a long ways to helping improve the relationship with the resident, the relationship with the public, by leveraging the right language and kind of pushing back on some of that. So I'm glad that you called that out, because it's a really good point. So to pick up and kind of bring this around towards the end, Jeremy, one of the last questions we asked, again, free form question. We didn't give them a whole bunch of options on this one. Actually, take it back. For this one, we did give them a bunch of options. We did give certain ones, and it was, what emerging trends do you believe will have the most significant impact on multifamily housing sector in 2025? Again, this was one that people could answer multiple. I think we gave them the opportunity to do 3. And the one that jumped off page on me on this one, and the note I put first and foremost was, it's the economy, stupid. Like it was the level of answers on that. I can't see the cheat screen. So what was the percentage that was on
economic pressures?
Yeah.
It looks like it's, 76%.
Yeah. So 76% had this basically in their top 3.
Yeah.
Which was, again, blew me away on it. The other one that is right up there with it was the concept of centralization and specialization. Again, I use those terms interchangeably. Also very, very strong, that this is still what's going to go through. And I'd say for that one, because for a long time, I used to joke that, the buzzwords were AI, and that was somebody put a new chart in their graphic, and it was AI. We're now at the point where AI is real and is being leveraged a lot. I think centralization and specialization is at that same basic tipping inflection point where we talked about it for a long time, and the leaders were doing it in their own kind of way. I think that is now one that is actually truly starting to gain ground. I mean, you and I were talking about a building yesterday,
right?
That you have where you're trying to figure out, okay, how could we potentially leverage it on a smaller unit count building? Right. So,
yeah. I wasn't that surprised with just the way this sort of fell out, only because all of the answers are good answers, but it is interesting to see how they stack rank. Centralization, specialization. I think that's economic pressures is sort of a generic catch-all. Centralization, specialization as the second most popular entry here. To me, the reason why 2025 and that topic comes into play is that, so we've been talking about that now as an industry for a few years.
Yeah.
And so that, I'll tell you, from my former employer, we start going to shows, seeing how other people are doing it, listening to it. That is not a snap your finger kind of thing.
No, it is not.
And you got to be super careful about even talking about it internally, because it's one thing to have an executive team meeting and you're talking about centralization, but if you talked about that on a town hall meeting, the freak out factor of the people that are like, my job's going away because it's going to be centralized. So it has to be very, very tactfully done in a way that is definitely better for the company, but with the employees in mind, that they don't get freaked out by it. Because you did a great podcast where it talks about how, hey, the specialization nature of where we're going is going to create specialists that don't have breadth of experience. And now they're a supposed to be a region manager or a property manager, and they've never dealt with some of these issues before because they centralized collections. Well, how do you overcome that? And I think there's certainly ways to do it. So companies need to be thoughtful about how they do it. And then whenever you start seeing the benefits economically, so the point number one, and you're a CFO of a company and say, hey, there's a way we can outsource or centralize. Let's do it right. Let's do it within the cycle of our operating rhythm, our annual operating rhythms as we set budgets. Let's do it with attrition in terms of employee in mind, not force it in RIF actions. That is a thoughtful way to do it. So it's slowly becoming something that is more and more prevalent that doesn't interrupt the culture of the organization.
I was talking with and this is one of the reasons I like the term specialization versus centralization. I was talking with a leader of a management company, NMHC top 25, who was well down this path. And they were saying, I wish I could remember the specific number, but it was well into the 80%, like 80, 85. It was in that neighborhood of the centralized roles, or the specialized roles they were filling with internal candidates. It was not, for them, it was not about a role reduction. It was about the efficiency and the effectiveness of being able to have specialists to deliver stronger results, which ultimately drop to the bottom line, not by a reduction of headcount necessarily. But you're absolutely right. I think that I've talked to a lot of groups over the years who are considering this on different levels. And that's one of the challenges they have, is like, how do we get all the input from the field that we actually need to make this really happen without freaking the field out? It's also one of the disconnects that this showed me, which is another reason I wanted to go and have the conversation with Dave Markowski about smart home technology. There are elements of centralization and role specialization that smart home technology, or IoT, let's just call it IoT, 1,000% enables. Meaning that it's going to be so much easier to achieve that if you're also doing motion detectors in the units that are tied to the thermostat, so you're not running the AC at 100, at 60 when it's 105 outside after the tech leaves. That's, locks are kind of the obvious ones, but being able to facilitate self-guided touring, after-hours touring, not having lease agent, you have to have that technology to truly be able to enable that, or you put in a lockbox and you're giving the same code out to everybody, and good luck when you get a squatter in that. So that was one, when I was looking at these ones that kind of jumped off, was that disconnect between, this is really important, but I don't know that they've gotten to the stage of, okay, but we got to do this in order to achieve this. The other one I'd love to get your feedback on this one, that was kind of, it was surprising to me it was this strong, was consolidation in the industry. And we left this open-ended. You could just find consolidation how you wanted.
Yeah.
But that was one that surprised me.
Yeah, I was a little surprised. I hadn't really even sort of thought about it, even though I've experienced it. And it's, the good and the bad of it. So there's obviously consolidation is one of those things that every business, every industry has. And, some industries, there's not very many players. Our industry is so fragmented that, you're always going to have some level of consolidation, especially on the operating side.
Yeah.
Of it. So I think one of the bigger challenges with just M&A in general, and I actually wrote a paper on this in grad school, and it's the challenge of the organizational behavior challenges of culture in M&A activities.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's, from a financial FinBro point of view, yeah, consolidation makes sense, redundancy and cost, get the cost out, better financials. But what can happen a lot of times is property management companies, as much as we all do sort of the same thing, boy, the cultures are completely different.
Yes.
And even the strategies are different. And 20,000 units getting acquired into something else. And, as somebody that's sort of gone through this, we use third-party management. We, the group that got acquired, in this case, we had this statement that said everything's going to be the same. You don't have to worry about anything, which is true for the first few months. But then things start to change.
Yeah, of course.
And if they're not well supported, if the teams that are getting acquired are not well supported, then they're going to end up getting frustrated and not know how to do their job. They're going to quit, and you're going to lose some institutional knowledge that was really hard to spreadsheet whenever you were doing the M&A work. So the M&A activity, and this is every industry, but our industry in particular, thinks sometimes too often that property management is property management is property management. And the culture fit, in my opinion, is probably um, one of the hardest things to really pencil out. Doesn't mean that you can't have two different cultures that are coming together, but when you recognize that as the consultants or the acquiring firm, that there is two different cultures, then you better double down on the work involved with creating the new culture in a way
Correct.
that is very supportive of the people that are probably a little scared, that are carrying all the institutional knowledge with them about their portfolio. So, um, I don't know. I think the consolidation will always be there just because that's what you do if you're in our business or many industries, is you're trying to get more and have the scale effect of what that looks like from an ultimate P&L or an EBITDA perspective. So, but if you get the culture part wrong in the consolidation, then 3 years later, the numbers are not going to have worked.
As someone who worked at a company that was doing 2 to 3 acquisitions a year for a while, believe me, I feel the pain you just
Yeah.
described. Like that was the biggest thing. Like when I look at the acquisitions that went well versus the acquisitions that struggled, it almost always came down to how well did the assimilation process
Right.
go? And that assimilation process is a two-way street. I mean, I could do a whole podcast on this and give you
Yeah.
case studies and all the other things with it. But it was something I want to call out because I was a little surprised to see it still that
Right.
strong. So the reality is we've seen some consolidation in the space, but not a ton
Right.
in there. So anyways, we did finish the survey as we wrap this up with another question that was really freeform. And again, to the survey participants, love what people were actually willing to share. And again, we weren't getting, again, the one word answers. And, we asked you, what excites you most about multifamily for 2025? Some of the themes that I pulled out of those, and there's one that I'm specifically going to call out. And originally I wasn't going to put his name on it, but he's going to know it's him as soon as he sees it. So I'll put his name on it. But the big ones I saw, definitely a theme that people are looking forward to: improved economic conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So even though that's their biggest concern, that they also think that's what's exciting them the most, which was a big one. The other one I saw that I'd love to get your take on was, and I summarized it as, an evolving operational model and the role that technology is going to play in it.
Mm.
People are excited about AI. It's no longer you're just trying to sell me something new on it. I think they're really excited about what the possibilities it actually can bring are.
Yeah, I would say that because it has permeated, AI and all of its forms have permeated consumer life, there is a willingness to accept it. So it's not a true B2B kind of thing. There's so much B2C on AI that it's now just sort of accepted, right? Our phones are all AI equipped. And so to the extent that it's not this scary black box as much as it was, I think allows the receptivity to how the software providers are all incorporating it into their solutions. So, and then the upside that represents for efficiencies is probably why people are more excited about it now than ever. I do think that, as as society just becomes more dependent on it, that sort of scares me. It's like, the large language learning models and all the different ways that it learns, is that going to stifle true creativity, true ability to do critical thinking, those kinds of things? I think it can inform, but it still doesn't, I think, get to the point where it can innovate, create. It's not going to replace the human mind. And so I feel like that it can add to it. And so without going all Terminator 2 on us, it's like it is a really cool advance that I think we're seeing, and it's accelerating and it's being accepted, but it still doesn't, and it won't replace the EQ element, the personal pizza party that you have with your residents, or even the creative thinking that has some sort of an emotional element to it. So that's sort of my own opinions on it.
Yeah.
And, you know, my kids use it more than I do. My partners use it more than I do.
You're saying you're an old fuddy-duddy.
A little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit of an old fuddy-duddy, but I certainly use it and I appreciate it. But at the same time, I'm like, did you think of that? Or did the machine think of that? Is sometimes how I think about. And you made an interesting comment about AI responses to LinkedIn posts, right? So it's like, yeah, I can tell that that's a job application that was run through ChatGPT 6 times
Yeah.
versus sort of the genuine and authentic. And so I still, as maybe an old fuddy-duddy, put a high value on genuine and authentic, even though there's a place for all of the large language learning models, all the different usage cases of AI.
Well, you bring up a good point, which was another theme that I saw in these was everyone's excited about innovation in the space, but there was a tone to it like, but I'm being forced into it. And I'll use the ChatGPT example in this one. As I mentioned, all these images were generated on ChatGPT by putting in the answer, but every single one of them, I also had to give feedback after the fact.
Yeah.
Of sometimes it would just literally misspell a word. Like it made me rethink. I had to go back and look at what I put in. Like, did I spell that wrong? No, they just did. Or just it wasn't capturing the ethos. And the other distinction I think that is a really good one that you brought up, they can't do the pizza party. They can't do those types of things. The way I would summarize that, and I didn't think about it until you said that, was these large language models, I think, are really good and only going to get better at being able to carry a conversation. They might even be able to build a relationship. They can't build community.
Right.
Because community is relationship intertwined with relationship, intertwined with relationship, intertwined with relationship. Excuse me. So it was just an interesting takeaway when you said that. I'd thought about, it probably could build a relationship. Scary.
Right.
But I don't see it building community anytime soon. We run communities.
You know, the funny anecdote on this, and this is, it's AI, I guess, but it's really smartphone in general. And it's sort of the Gen Alphas and how they use their phone for community. And so it's just a funny anecdote is like, I can't remember who was the originator on this sort of comical anecdote, which is, smartphones, teenagers, everything that goes into it. I get my social connection from my phone. I don't need to I don't even need to go have friends outside of my phone, right? I can have friendships inside of my phone and have all of that social connection. And then the funny anecdote was, but the backseat of a car, if you think about sort of old school, what happens in backseat of cars whenever you're teenagers, you can't really do that with the phone, right? I mean, I guess you could in a weird way.
Yeah,
but it's like,
about how you do that in a weird way.
But my point is that there's still human interaction that is needed, whether it's good or bad, that is needed in society, and it can't be replaced by technology.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. And to kind of wrap it up, because there was a lot of enthusiasm around artificial intelligence in what's going to be good for multifamily. And I think the person who probably summed it up the best and probably the most enthusiastically was Alex O'Brien, the chief executive officer over at the Cardinal Group. And it's a little bit of an inside joke because when I asked him last year, everyone was like, do you believe in, survive till 25? He's like, I'm going to thrive in 24.
Yeah. So
of course he threw this back in. He says, 25 is the time to thrive. This will be the biggest transitions year in our industry. And as AI moves into all parts of our business, from underwriting to operations to construction. And I really agree with him on this. I think we're going to see it just, again, continue to permeate and actually become a reality and not just a talking point. So with that, Jeremy, thank you so much for coming in here and giving the banner back and forth. Yeah. Otherwise, this would have been a horrible monologue the entire time. For those of you who've made it this far, we are writing an entire ebook around these results as well. So the results will be made public. And if you want those, just go ahead and comment or DM me directly. We're happy to get those to you. But we appreciate you coming on. We hope you got some of the same insights that we do. And all of us here at LeaseLock are looking forward to a great 25 as we decide to thrive through it. Thanks a lot. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Unscripted, a LeaseLock podcast. If you have found the information in this episode, or any other for that matter, beneficial in any way, the best way to support the work we do is to like and subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll be sure to never miss a new episode when they drop. Also, sharing your takeaways in the comments or on the social media platform of your choosing, mine happens to be LinkedIn, is also a great way to help us get the message out. Additionally, if you would like to suggest a guest or perhaps be a guest on Unscripted, please head over to leaselock.com/unscripted, where at the bottom of the page you'll find a guest submission form. We would love to help you tell your story. Until next time, make it a great day.